The principal characteristic of the age, the coming of age of humanity, is unity. Humanity has arrived at the point that it can see itself as one people, it can see itself as one people, and the earth as a common homeland. And Baha'u'lláh says, the well-being of mankind, its peace and security are unattainable unless and until its unity is established. This is the next great challenge ahead of the human race. The human race will not advance further. Civilization will not advance further. We will not solve our problems, whether they're environmental or questions of disarmament or questions of racial harmony or until we solve this one problem. And we have it all backwards. We have the naive idea that unity is some far-off goal, perhaps. First of all, we must solve this problem and that problem. Well, all we do is stagger deeper and deeper and deeper into the morass of our own making.
The Baha'i perspective on the challenges facing the world come from the teachings of Bahá'u'lláh, the founder of the Baha'i faith. In his writings, Baha'u'lláh describes the nature of justice and unity necessary for world peace and the progress of humanity. In this program, Mr. Douglas Martin of the Office of Public Information of the Baha'i International Community talks about Baha'u'lláh and his vision of our common future.
We are hearing from every side. All the media, all the sources of information in our world are now telling us ever more frequently that we are approaching the end of one millennium, the beginning of a new one. It seems to me, as a Baha'i, that what this realization does, is to throw into sharper focus the crucial need facing the human race. The crucial need facing the human race is to find, as a desperate need of the human race, is to find a unifying vision of the nature of man and society. We have spent the last century, roughly speaking, trying out all kinds of ideological formulae that were presented to us by Marxism, fascism, and so on. And what has happened is that their interpretations of history, their promises for the future, have simply been exploded. They have collapsed in on themselves. They have exhausted themselves. We have arrived at the end of this present millennium no longer having any certainty. It is inconceivable that without a common conviction about the course and purpose of human history, that foundations can be laid for a global society to which the mass of humanity can commit themselves. What interests me, whether I was a Baha'i or not, I think I would be interested in, is that precisely such a vision emerges in the writings of Baha'u'lláh. In the middle years of the 19th century, people had a very different view about religious questions, for example, than they have today. The 19th century, the middle years of the 19th century, were a period of intense religious ferment. There was a ferment of all kinds going on, whether in the field of literature or philosophy, whatever. But specifically in the religious sphere, it was the age of millennialism, and not only in Christianity, but in Buddhism, and especially in Islam, and even among the native peoples of North America, for example, especially the latter half of the 19th century. Many, many examples of this sense that we were living in the days of some profound change, or the latter days, I suppose, to use Christian terminology or other terms. In any event, I think that it's important when we're talking about Baha'u'lláh to set his mission in this historical context. And of all the millennialist movements, whether Christian or Islamic or Aboriginal or whatever, the most dramatic, the most impassioned was certainly the Babi movement in Persia. which you hear very little about today, but you heard a great deal about. A lot of quite influential Western thinkers in that middle years of the 19th century were immensely attracted by this young, heroic, saintly figure, the Bab, who appeared, who said that a new day was about to dawn, that whole new fields of learning were going to open up, that a child of that day would be more enlightened and more capable than the most erudite scholar of his own age. Whole new fields of study would open up, and so on. So you have a tremendous ferment, and the principal thing that he said was that the day had come when he whom God would make manifest, the universal messenger of God or manifestation of God expected by the followers of all religion, was going to appear. Not of one religion, not the return just of Christ, not the Qaim or the Mahdi of Islam or the Maitreya Buddha of Buddhism but the universal manifestation of God, whom all mankind were awaiting, who had been spoken of in different names, different terms, different forms in all the great scriptures of the world. And it is this role that Baha'u'lláh claims to have fulfilled. And I think that that probably is very important to recognize that though he himself was a prince, though he himself was born to wealth and position in society, the revelation of God was itself born in a dungeon. Because when Baha'u'lláh, who was of a noble family, became an ardent advocate of the Babi movement, he began to suffer the same consequences that all the other followers of the Bab did. The Bab himself, as we know, was executed. Thousands of his followers were martyred in horribly ingenious and grisly manner. And during the course of it, not even the position of a person like Baha'u'lláh protected him from being caught up in these waves of persecution. He was seized, he was put in this horrifying dungeon, the so-called Black Pit in Tehran, notorious throughout the country. They had made it as dramatic to cast fear, I suppose, into the hearts and minds of the populace. But there was a chain, I forget the name now, but it had its own name, which they applied to it as this notorious chain, and if you were a very serious criminal in the eyes of the ruling authorities, you would be cast into the Black Pit, have this great chain which you couldn't even support. They used to have a wooden fork that held part of it up. So he was put into this Black Pit. He would almost certainly have been murdered on the spot had it not been that the massacres had aroused such Western revulsion that the Western ambassadors were beating a path to the Shah's door, warning him of the very serious consequences that he was inviting if he had persisted. And Baha'u'lláh, being a person of enormous reputation already, both as a philanthropist, as a scholar, as a thinker, this would have been more costly, I suppose, than the Shah was prepared to accept. So he was put in prison, assuming he would die, and it was in that prison that the revelation of God was born. Now this is amazing. We, at last, have, in the words of a messenger of God, we have a detailed and intimate description of the experience of divine revelation. Baha'u'llah's own words. He speaks of of being consigned to 4 months in this place foul beyond description. Actually, it was an abandoned reservoir deep underneath the city, which had been simply blocked off. It was overrun with vermin. It was filthy. There were 100 or 150 criminals of the worst sort. They were all chained together. Those who were followers of the Bab, one of them was dragged out every day and blown from a cannon, or the holes chopped him and lighted candles put in. Anything that the mind could find that was ingenious to make people suffer. And under these conditions, Baha'u'lláh said, one night in a dream, these exalted words were heard on every side. Quote, verily we shall render thee victorious by thyself and by thy pen. Grieve thou not for that which hath befallen thee, neither be thou afraid, for thou art in safety. Ere long God will raise up the treasures of the earth, men who will aid thee through thyself and through thy name, wherewith God hath revived the hearts of such as have recognized him. This was his experience of revelation. Now, he was a messenger of God, all right? A messenger of God is not someone who goes to school and studies to become a messenger, or someday he suddenly acquires the capacity to become a messenger. Bahá'u'lláh says that messengers of God are human beings who have that additional capacity to become vehicles, which distinguishes them from all of the rest of the human race, precisely as the sun is qualitatively different from the planets, shares many of the characteristics of the planets that revolve around it in the solar system. But it is different from them in one vital respect, in that it is itself the source of light and power and heat and energy. And all of the rest of the solar system derive energy and light from that central source. So Bahá'u'lláh says a messenger of God is Christ, Muhammad, Buddha, Abraham, Moses, Zoroaster, Krishna, back beyond recorded time. These have been these extraordinary figures. But despite the fact that they have been born with this capacity, the moments come when the revelation, because of their receptivity, because of their capacity, is bestowed on them. And he says, during the days I lay in the prison at Tehran, though the galling weight of the chains and the stench-filled air allowed me but little sleep, still in those infrequent moments of slumber, I felt as if something flowed from the crown of my head over my breast, even as a mighty torrent that precipitateth itself upon the earth from the summit of a lofty mountain. Every limb of my body would, as a result, be set afire. At such moments my tongue recited what no man could bear to hear. So Bahá'u'lláh eventually was released from prison. He was sent into exile, the first of a series of exiles. He had no trial, of course, no recourse. They simply stripped him of his possessions. And during the course of these exiles, he began to unfold in a body of writings his message, the message that had been entrusted to him by God and continued to be revealed to him throughout the rest of his life. From prison, first of all in Adrianople and subsequently in Akka, Bahá'u'lláh wrote what I think must surely be the most remarkable series of the most remarkable documents in religious history. He addressed the rulers of his world. He addressed Queen Victoria, Emperor Napoleon III of France, the Kaiser Wilhelm I, Tsar Alexander II, the Shah, the Sultan, Pope Pius IX, the leaders of his world. His message was that the day that God had set in motion historical forces that were going to bring about the unification of mankind. But God had revealed himself, Bahá'u'lláh was the messenger of God, and he called on the rulers of the world to use their enormous advantages to further this process. These people had it in their capacity to reconcile humanity to its oneness, to reconcile Christians to the fact that God had also spoken to Muslims and Buddhists, to reconcile white people to the fact that black people were just the same race as they and equal in every respect, to reconcile people to the men to the fact that women were their equal in every respect. They didn't even want them to vote. The task of reconciling humanity to its oneness was the challenge that Bahá'u'lláh, in this extraordinary series of letters, placed before the world's leaders. And the world's leaders, of course, chose to ignore him, as you would anticipate. You see this wasted opportunity, a century of wasted opportunity. And with that great watershed of World War I, suddenly the bottom drops out of everything. Not only do they shoot the Tsar and the Cellar and send all the other kings into exile, when they become non-entities, really, appendages to a republican world, but everything else, all the possibilities of accomplishing the beneficial ends are steadily removed from the hands of the rulers of human affairs. And it is this sequence of events that has brought us to the point that we are at today, when the world now at last is turning. It's extraordinary. Exactly what Baha'u'lláh predicted would come has come. Baha'u'lláh foresaw what lay ahead of humanity. And his prescriptions, of course, are as relevant today. It's just that now at last God has our attention, I guess you could say, because we at last have decided, generally speaking, that all the real issues facing us at the end of this century, at the end of this millennium, are issues of collective action. There is no significant issue today that is not a global issue. No significant issue that is not a challenge to unity. No significant issue that does not challenge us to free ourselves from our parochial attachments, from lesser identities to this race or this religion or that religion, this nation or that nation, or ideology one from another. The challenge is to free ourselves. We know this. Most of us are aware of this. The effort of will that's required. First of all, we simply need a place to stand where we can simply be human beings, where we can simply be citizens of the earth. Doesn't mean that we give up our countries any more than I'm a Canadian, for example. Toronto is my home. I love the city. I'm no less a Torontonian just because I'm a Canadian. These things are not contradictory. They're in fact quite the opposite. In fact, they reinforce one another. Similarly, you become a citizen of the world. You become genuinely conscious of yourself, first and foremost as a human being, and this is perfectly harmonious with being a Canadian or Japanese or Norwegian or whatever you happen to be. There's no conflict, whatever. Quite the opposite. But we need a place to stand. We need a rallying point, as we have always in our history needed. And Baha'u'lláh provides this, and it was this essentially that he offered to the leaders of the 19th century world, in which they rejected. And what Baha'u'lláh says is that humanity has developed capacities that have prepared it for its coming of age, have prepared it for the age of maturity, that is the real experience that the human race is having today. What is that? What that is, the principal characteristic of the coming of age of humanity is unity. Humanity has arrived at the point that it can see itself as one people. It can see itself as one people and the earth as a common homeland. And Baha'u'lláh says, the well-being of mankind, its peace and security are unattainable unless and until its unity is established. This is the next great challenge ahead of the human race. The human race will not advance further. Civilization will not advance further. We will not solve our problems, whether they're environmental or questions of disarmament or questions of racial harmony or until we solve this one problem. And we have it all backwards. We have the naive idea that unity is some far-off goal, perhaps. First of all, we must solve this problem and that problem. Well, all we do is stagger deeper and deeper and deeper into the morass of our own making. It's like, Baha'u'lláh says, unity is like the comb. The comb runs through the hair, everything flows with it. You can't tease all the tangles out with your fingers. Unity is the challenge, and just as each of the other manifestations of God have come with a specific capacity to call out new qualities in humanity, the distinguishing characteristic of the revelation of Baha'u'lláh is to make possible the unification of humanity through the development of the consciousness in humanity of its oneness. Let me just conclude what I'm saying, if I may, by talking briefly about what Baha'u'lláh said represented the heart of his mission, focal point of it. As I've already explained, he said that we live in the age of the coming of age of the human race. Mankind is on the threshold of its maturity. We will be mature when we are living as a united humankind in a society that's truly universal, that accepts the whole diversity of humanity without putting one lower than the rest, and so on. Now he said that the characteristic of this time is that for the first time, I may have mentioned this already, humanity is capable of seeing itself as one people in one global homeland. And this fact makes possible what he termed a new covenant between God and humankind. Now this is fascinating. He says literally there is open to mankind a new relationship with God that never existed before. It is possible for humanity, by turning to God, by embracing God's revelation for today, by beginning to order its affairs according to the standards of that revelation, by accepting the full equality of women in human affairs, reorganizing human affairs so that women play as equals with men, totally abandoning racial prejudice of any kind, encouraging, celebrating racial integration in its most complete form, so-called racial intermarriage, and so on. The establishment of a world government to which national governments will surrender a degree of their sovereignty, the organization of the economic resources of the planet for the benefit of the entire human race. The encouragement of the application of the scientific method, as I've already mentioned, I think, to all the phenomena of existence, this balance between religion and science, for example. Is that if humanity, and let me add also, certain moral principles that impinge on the individual very closely. You know, the thing about God is he sees things differently than we do. He has certain priorities that are different from the priorities, sort of the cultural patterns that we have grown up with. And for example, something that the revelation of God for this day condemns as a very, very serious offense is backbiting and gossip. Well, this is certainly not, generally speaking, regarded as a shortcoming. It's a higher art form for many people in our society. But in this age, the age which must be characterized by unity, it strikes at the very heart of unity. It is poisonous. And so he said, humanity is challenged for the next generations to come to train itself out of this particular habit. There are many other things. The use of narcotics, for instance, are condemned. That is condemned very, very severely. He speaks of it as extinguishing the life of the soul. But interestingly enough, the only other thing he speaks of with the same vehemence is backbiting. He signals, and this is certainly not an order of priorities. I think your average person in Toronto or any other city today would be immediately comfortable with it. It takes some little adjustment. In any event, he says that as humanity, because there's no if about it, we believe that humanity is moving in that direction, as he describes it, as humanity embraces the revelation of God for today, as it reorganizes its own thinking, its own attitudes, its own organization of its affairs, along those lines laid out for it by the revelation of God, that mankind will enter into a new relationship with God, and that the fruit of this new relationship will be the emergence of a new race, a new human race that will be as distinct from the present races, so-called races of our planet, as they are from one another. A race which will not be characterized by shades of color or shapes of eyes or noses or ears or something. It will be a race that is, because it is human, it will exemplify qualities that are at present latent in the peoples of the world as we exist today. And that new race of man, Bahá'u'lláh says, is beginning to emerge. Already, the influence of this impulse has drawn into its embrace people who represent the entire diversity of the human race. I mean the whole diversity. There is no spot on the planet where the pattern of life taught by Baha'u'lláh is not being pursued by people who regard themselves as believers in him, followers of his path. A Britannica yearbook a couple of years ago, 1988 or 89, pointed out that the Baha'i community is the most widely spread religious, if you want to call it just a religious community, on earth, with the sole exception of Christianity. But we've been at it less than 100 years, and yet it is everywhere. We know that in Canada, it's in Eskimo villages in the Arctic and Indian reserves all the way across Canada. We know that it's in Andean villages throughout Latin America and the most remote islands of the Pacific. You name it. Remote African villages, pygmy villages, wherever human beings are, there you find this Baha'i community. The sheer spiritual energy required to accomplish that in the space of a few decades has no parallel in modern history. What Baha'u'lláh brings, that is a plus, I suppose you could say, is a plan that embraces man's social relationships. That is a plan and a vision for the collective reorganization of human affairs, for the seizing of the responsibility for the collective future of the human race. And that is the covenant. That is the essence of Baha'u'llah's message.